No. And we are now going to transition to we're going to transition to a discussion of the soul view as articulated from the perspective of the early modern philosopher Rene Descartes, who is among a handful of other philosophers from various historical epochs considered among the most important and influential. So in company with figures like Plato, Aristotle, Immanuel Kant, and we'll be discussing Kant a little bit later as a response to Hume's skepticism of personal identity or self next week. So he's considered, as I mentioned in my little preparatory write-up for the reading this week, the father of modern philosophy, and he was also a physicist, and more importantly than that, a mathematician. And so there were ancient accounts of the soul, but in terms of providing an epistemological foundation for the very possibility of carrying out the project of modern science, Descartes' arguments from the 17th century here, in this work in particular, we're talking about something from 1641. This has become really decisive in its importance in inaugurating, as I also mentioned in my write-up or description, in setting forth or initiating or inaugurating the modern subject and these foundational ideas surrounding modern subjectivity. That is, what it means to be a subject versus an object. So here is where the subject-object split as this kind of binary opposition or dualism gets first structured and put to work in the history of philosophy. So we're talking about the 17th century here, that is the 1600s. And so we'll be dealing with epistemological questions, that is, what can we know as persons or selves or minds or souls, as Descartes would have it. That is, what can we know to be true? And for Descartes, knowledge is always knowledge of truth, as we saw with the early Greek thinkers. So that idea still persists, but knowledge of truth is marked by certainty at this point. So we can only truly, justly, legitimately claim to know something insofar as we know it with absolute, unquestionable, indubitable, unshakable certainty, such that, not that it's difficult to doubt it, because it seems so clear and obvious, but in fact, it's impossible to doubt it, because doubting this very foundational epistemic item, which we'll call epistemic bedrock, the very ground for all possible knowledge, would amount to a contradiction. And so that's ultimately what Descartes is seeking, the absolute unquestionable foundation for knowledge that provides as a kind of architectural support for the advent of any further knowledge. So she trades on these kind of architectural metaphors throughout. Okay, so are there any questions so far before I have some slides that we'll jump into? And as is usual, if you have a question, if something doesn't make sense, or if you'd like to make a comment, you can just interrupt. But actually first, yeah, so let me pull up these slides, and then I have a little shitty drawing that I put together on the whiteboard that we'll turn to in just a moment. Let me see. So this is a list of possible meaningful candidates as responses to the question of what is the principle of identity or the principle of individuation, as Locke would have it. And so we can subsume these various approaches or categorize them in this manner. So first we can talk about the self. So again, when I'm asking about the self, the ultimate question is, what is that X that endures through time yet remains the same, unchanging, despite other changes, perhaps relatively superficial changes, changes in one's body, for example, changes in one's thinking habits, changes in one's beliefs or ideas or one's experiences? What is it, despite these powerful or subtle transformations, that endures as self-same in order to allow the individual in question to remain that individual despite these changes? So here are the answers that we might leverage, and this isn't, of course, a comprehensive list. There are other possible responses we might entertain. So Gretchen Wayrob's idea from the John Perry dialogue that we discussed last week, she was a physicalist, according to which, or a materialist, according to which view there is only material substances that constitute the very nature of reality, that populate the cosmos as such, which means that insofar as you are a self that exists, that self has to be material too, which means it's a body. So the self is one's immediate physical body. But we've already dealt with some problems with this. So as we talked about last week, our bodies can change dramatically. So you can lose a limb, you can go bald, you can shrink in old age, you can gain a tremendous amount of weight or lose a tremendous amount of weight, or our bodies can change subtly. So our cells basically are reproduced, are replaced every 7 years, as we noted as well last week. If you lose a single strand of hair, the very body with which you identify yourself is no longer, strictly speaking, the same, because some kind of alteration has taken place. So that's one issue. And then there's the ship of Theseus thought experiment, which actually Karina, I think it was Karina who mentioned in one of our hypothesis annotations, not by name, but by, yeah, the example of a broom, right? I really like that example. And we don't want to spend too much time on that, because that's actually something we'll talk about in some detail next week when we talk about Hume, because he uses this thought experiment too to challenge the very idea of an enduring self or personal identity. So we don't need to get into that, but we'll return to this and talk about the ship of Theseus next week. And then another problem, and this comes up first in the Wayrob discussion with Miller on the second day. He says, look, when you wake up in the morning, before you even open your eyes, you seem to have a liminal sense of who you are without having to verify it by some kind of bodily perception or identity or recognition. And so this is very similar to Avicenna's floating man thought experiment, which we'll talk about on Thursday. So that's a sign for Thursday's discussion. Yeah, Karina, go ahead.
I put my hand down for a reason, but I was just going to say how, like, there is like this moment, like when you wake up, that's sort of like an in-between dream and reality, or maybe not reality, but what we call reality, where you reconstruct your entire identity, like in that, like, just couple seconds as you wake up.
Yeah, so you're saying there's this even more liminal space between sleep and wakefulness in which there is no identity, but that identity is recovered and reconstructed or reorganized within a flash of a moment. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw it more elegantly put somewhere, and I don't remember how it was put, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's almost as if you're recovering your presence from a moment of non-existence. And that seems to depend on our capacity for memory. And that's very interesting too, if we consider memory in the work that it does to construct and sustain personal identity. It's interesting to think about how it's grounded in language. Not entirely, because memories are articulated imagistically too, but we can re-articulate them through discourse, right, through language. And that's interesting to think of language as logos in the Greek sense. as a kind of gathering of sense, of pulling things together. So there's a sort of logos in which we gather the sense of who we are from sources of our past experience through the vehicle of memory. So that's just an interesting aside. But we'll talk about that too next week, but we'll talk about it next week from the point of view of Hume, who's critical of it. But we'll talk about it tomorrow from Avicenna, the 10th century Islamic thinker, or 11th century, I should say. And then another issue with the body view is that one can imagine occupying an entirely different body, but remaining the same person. And there are countless sci-fi scenarios in which this is depicted. So whether you're transferring your consciousness to some cloud, for example, in which case you're no longer really strongly corporeal, that is bodily, or you might transfer your consciousness to a robot, or perhaps you exchange consciousness with another human individual. So through that way you take on a new body, or maybe you are reincarnated after death. And what that entails is your consciousness occupies a new material form. So there are all sorts of ways to think about that, which means your body isn't necessary for you to continue as you are. And then there's this sort of brain rejuvenation notion that John Perry presents to us in the third night of the dialogue from last week. So you can imagine, instead of having your brain replaced, so having an entirely new brain or taking on the brain of another person in a transplant, you can imagine having your brain, your present physical brain, as the organ that is at the center of your nervous system, rejuvenated. And by that, Perry means in this rejuvenation, you will now, through the circuitry of your physical brain, match the psychological traits of another individual. So you'll have the same physical brain, but the patterns, perhaps, through which a sense of self and sensibility, intelligibility writ large in terms of how you perceive and understand reality would be altered, but the brain would be the same in its essential material formation. So then in that sense, the body isn't really altered, but something more local within the body in terms of patterning and so forth. And then here we get to this week's discussion. So let's say, and this was also discussed by the three interlocutors in Perry's dialogue, the idea that the soul is the self. And so as Miller accepted, just for argument's sake, although nuances or distinctions might be made, soul is identical with mind, which is identical with consciousness, which is, you might say, identical with spirit. So for our present purposes, all those things mean precisely the same from the point of view of Descartes. And so what are some problems? Well, we already examined an epistemological problem with it. And so that's a problem that has to do with the possibility of knowledge. And so even if the soul exists, since it's by definition unobservable, it is immaterial and unobservable. So while the soul is the agent that conducts perception, whether visual, auditory, olfactory, or whatever, it itself is not available to be perceived visually, auditorily, olfactorily, and so forth. Olfactory having to do with the sense of smell. But if that's the case, then it's impossible to know whether for every body there is one corresponding soul. So it could be that you change souls as frequently as you change underwear, as was humorously proposed in that dialogue. Since it can't be observed, there's no way that we can observe it to be the same. And that's a line straight from Weyrob in the dialogue. What cannot be observed to be the same. And for that reason, she rejects the principle of identity as soul. And she's following John Locke in that regard, who for his part was critical of Descartes, coming just after Descartes. So we're taking this a little bit historically backwards here. But the course is thematically organized, not strictly by historical lines. So just keep that in mind. And then there's this idea of process. So this was the notion that we pulled out of Locke, that self is consciousness in the sense of the ligature of memory, that is the organizing power of memory, mnemonic thought. So the self is constituted by one's memories connecting the present to the past through recollection and to the future through anticipation. So remember those two poles, one of the past and one of the future, are the necessary conditions for the establishment of identity. But remember some problems, and we talked about these last time. It's impossible to distinguish between real memories and only apparent ones, because memories can be so easily falsified and manipulated. Then a further issue is that memory loss would seem to mean a loss of personhood. So the extent to which you lose certain anchors from your past, that is certain memories, to that extent as well, you lose your identity to those past moments. And so here's where I want to stop sharing for just a moment and pull up this crappy drawing. Hopefully it's still here. God damn it, it disappeared. So I'll just draw it real quick. It's not like I put too much effort into it. So, all right. So let's see, this is you at 5. And this is you at 25. And then got a couple hairs left. Your torso shrunk. And this is you at 60. So this is another issue with the idea that personal identity or self is ultimately constituted of memory. So it's not that memory is possible on the basis of a priorly articulated self or identity. It's that memory is actually productive of self. And so what's a problem with that we didn't talk about already? Well, there's a kind of contradiction that appears. So let's say as a 25-year-old, you have memories, you have certain memories of events that occurred when you were 5, of experiences that you had when you were 5. And now let's say that as a 60-year-old, you remember being 25. You pretty vividly remember certain experiences or events then. So that means at this point, since at 25, you remember being 5, there's an identity between them, right? That's what connects you at 25 to who you were at 5. Now, because at 60, you also recover these vivid memories of who you were at 25, there's an identity that obtains between those as well. So your 25-year-old self is identical to your 60-year-old self. But then let's say at 60, you do not recall any of your experiences at 5 years old. So what happens here is your 5-year-old self is identical to your 25-year-old self, and your 25-year-old self is identical to your 60-year-old self, but your 60-year-old self is now not identical to your 5-year-old self. That appears to be a contradiction. So how could that be? Does that make sense, how this is a problem? Because obviously there had to be an enduring self to bring you from one age to the other, but since there is a break between your 60-year-old self and your 5-year-old self, that identity no longer obtains. And from Locke's theoretical approach, you could no longer, strictly speaking, be said to be the same person. Okay. And so for that reason, for that reason, many philosophers reject the idea of personal identity as grounded in memory. Hume, as we'll see next week, is one of these philosophers, although he thinks that memory is certainly indispensable for what we take in an illusory way to be self or identity. Okay, so if you have any questions about that, just jump in, but I'm going to continue here with the slides, and we'll take a little bit of a break in about 15 minutes or so. Okay, so we're dealing with meditations 1 and 2 today, and we'll probably have to carry this conversation over a little bit on Thursday before digging into that session's material. But this was published in 1641, so we're talking about the 17th century here. And is anyone familiar with the kind of global upheaval that was happening at this period? A period of tremendous growth, instability, and change. So what was going on around this time? Can anyone speak to that? Yeah, colonialism is one of those things. So that's good. So especially for those colonized or would-be colonized people, we're talking about tremendous uncertainty and disability, or instability, I should say. What about something in the scientific community? Is anyone familiar with the history of science? Well, just about a decade or so before this, Galileo was put on house arrest for his controversial scientific findings on the basis of new technological apparatuses, in particular the telescopes, powerful telescopes he had created and advanced, which questioned, having given support to the Copernican heliocentric worldview, which challenged the centrality of the geocentric model, which had been inherited from Ptolemy, and before Ptolemy, Aristotle. And it was also embraced by the Catholic Church. And this is because the Catholic Church was dominated by a philosophical position, a kind of ideology, actually, known as scholasticism. And scholasticism is what dominated the intellectual milieu of Europe at the time. It was an unsurpassable authority that couldn't be questioned, as you see in the case of Galileo. And at the end of the 16th century, so we're talking like 1590, Giordano Bruno in Italy was actually burned at the stake for simply suggesting that there might be an infinity of worlds. And he didn't even do so intentionally as a kind of heterodox thinker or an atheist, right? He thought that he was glorifying God with the idea that there could be a plurality, indeed an infinity of worlds. But he was killed for it. He was martyred for it. And so there were profound changes happening. And this is also connected to colonialism with the new discoveries, new empirical advancements, new political and social arrangements that were under development and so forth. But scholasticism was marked by the authority of the church on the one hand, that is the theological side, and the indubitable authority of, albeit a pagan, Aristotle on the philosophical side. And so Medieval philosophers like St. Thomas Aquinas, most dramatically, most famously, worked by synthesizing the insights of pagan philosophers, principally Aristotle, with the doctrine of the Catholic Church. And so one had to be very careful, challenging important aspects of that inherited authority that one would have to recognize and work within or work around to some extent. And so, oops, let me go back. And so that's just a little bit of historical detail there. And so Descartes was seeking to establish scientific knowledge on a firm foundation. And this was a challenge to scholasticism. So he had to be very, very careful in his language in addressing the church fathers from whom he wanted support. And so really the target then in his challenge to scholasticism is Aristotle. And Aristotle argues, as a sort of proto-empiricist, Aristotle argues that what comes to us, to our mind, only arrives to be thought having previously worked through the channels of perception or sense. So there's nothing in the thought which isn't first in the senses. And for this reason, methodologically, Aristotle thinks that we have to use our senses because it's only with the material supplied by the senses that the mind can do its work. And this is something that Descartes is going to challenge in this work here, the Meditations. And so he wants to show, after undermining the authority of Aristotelian scholasticism, he wants to show that mind and body are fundamentally distinct. And then this is a kind of ancillary point for our purposes that we won't dig into in much detail. He wants to prove that God exists using only reason, so unaided reason. And he makes those arguments in the third and fifth meditations, which we won't be reading. So we're only dealing with the first two meditations, although I will draw an argument from the sixth meditation just to put us in a position to understand a better way to arrive at his dualistic conclusion than what we find in the second meditation. And so what I have in italics here is a major presuppositional insight. So a kind of intellectual starting point that's informing Descartes' overall project. So there are aspects of the external world that we can and must prove. So if you have to scientifically or otherwise, just through your own basic experience, prove that something is true, then that means if proof is necessary, that the very phenomenon or object or reality that you're endeavoring to prove was not before that moment explicitly clear in its nature or in its being as a kind of explanatory concern, right? So we need to establish proof of matters, again, scientifically or personally, experientially, because some aspects of our life, of the world, and our efforts to make sense of it are confused and incomplete. But further, if there are aspects of the external world that we have to prove because they are complex and confusing, this presupposes for its part that is to say, if such proof is even possible, that there has to be some things that we can neither prove or that we even need to prove because they're foundational, they prove themselves. And it's from the grounding of such a foundation that we can carry out the scientific project of making sense of that which was previously nonsensical, making clear that which was previously confused, and finishing in our order of knowledge that in which we previously had gaps of understanding. So that's really what motivates his project here. Does that make sense, or any questions about that?
Can you give an example of something that doesn't need to be proven, please?
That's a good question. And that's kind of where we're going. So I don't want to give that away because that's actually what he's looking for. And so we're going to have to walk with Descartes through this process of reasoning to arrive at those things, which, although at the point of arrival we'll be clarifying and illuminating them, at that moment we'll also see that these are things we already previously knew. And that we always already know them. In fact, we're only going to look at one of those things, and it's an example of absolute significance. And so that's really the conclusion. So I don't want to give it away at the beginning, although for those who did the reading, you probably already have a fairly good sense of what I'm gesturing towards or what I'm referring to here. But does that make sense, Shane?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah, so this is just to lay out at the beginning a kind of map of what we're investigating and where we hope to arrive. And so this is a kind of assumption at the beginning. Descartes thinks if it's possible to prove anything, then there has to be some unchanging, completely stable ground from which to achieve such demonstration or proof. And then the next point in his methodological approach or system will be to demonstrate exactly what that foundation is. But first, he has to destroy, so he uses these architectural metaphors, this kind of architectural language. He first has to destroy the very foundation that we've received from the ancients, in particular Aristotle, because until that's destroyed and gotten rid of, we're going to continue in a sort of self-deceptive way, a kind of oblivious way to be operating on it and seeking knowledge from the basis of a method that's unsound, fundamentally. So he has to destroy that foundation and replace it with a new foundation. And that's what he wants to do. Okay, so does that make sense? And so we can talk about, yeah, just let me know if you have questions like Shane did. That was a good question. His procedure and an assumption that guides all of this. So methodological skepticism. I'm going to find, and I'll do this periodically so that we can stay in touch with the text. So on 1-4, or actually, for this time, I did not actually ask you to read this part of the text. So I didn't even supply it for you. So this is in the synopsis of the 6 meditations that comes before the preface or meditation 1. He says, although the utility of a doubt which is so great does not at first appear, it is at the same time very great, inasmuch as it delivers us from every kind of prejudice and sets out for us a very simple way by which the mind may detach itself from the senses. So that's what he's talking about. So radical doubt, a radical skepticism. So he wants to doubt everything he previously took for granted or thought he knew until he finds something that cannot possibly be doubted. Again, as I described earlier today, not something that it's difficult to doubt owing to its obviousness or familiarity, but something that is impossible to doubt because once you doubt it, you're contradicting yourself through that effort. And that might not make too much sense now, but we'll look at some examples. And so this is different from ancient so-called Pyrrhonian skepticism, the skepticism of the ancient Hellenistic Greeks, because for their part, they were skeptical of everything in a non-methodological way. That is to say, without taking for granted that there will be some end game that will rescue us from the state of skepticism. And so that's what distinguishes Descartes' approach here from the ancients, and also from Hume, as we'll see, who next week, who follows the ancients more closely. But for Descartes, he holds as a possibility from the very beginning, before he even deploys the skeptical approach, that there will be a way to release himself from the skepticism. And that point will happen once he arrives at some knowledge that cannot be doubted. That is absolute certainty. And then there's this essential assumption at play, and that is epistemological foundationalism, according to which there is some ultimate foundation without which no knowledge is possible. And so this is what philosophers call epistemic bedrock, another kind of building or architectural metaphor. So when you're building, you want solid ground, you want bedrock, so it won't shift and destroy your foundation. And so at our reading, this really is expressed by the meditator, or Descartes, at the beginning of meditation 1. So 1.6, our very first page, and this is in the first sentence. But he says, and I'm just splitting up the sentence here, he says, I was convinced that I must once for all seriously undertake to rid myself of all the opinions which I had formerly accepted and commence to build anew from the foundation if I wanted to establish any permanent structure in the sciences. And then to skip some way at the bottom of that second paragraph, still on page 6, he says, and for that end, it will not be requisite that I should examine each in particular, which would be an endless undertaking. For owing to the fact that the destruction of the foundation of necessity brings with it the downfall of the rest of the edifice, I shall only in the first place attack those principles upon which all my former opinions rested. So it would be an endless task to actually, in an explicit way, submit every piece of knowledge that you previously claimed to this unrelenting skepticism. So instead, he's going to submit the very foundation that would ground all of those pieces of knowledge in some kind of truth from his point of view. He's going to submit that to this unrelenting skepticism. Just like if you attach dynamite to the foundation of a structure, it could be a 100-story skyscraper, right? But if you attach dynamite to the foundation, you don't have to worry about eliminating every floor, right? Every floor is going to collapse once you have pulled the ground from beneath it. So that's his approach here in terms of this methodology. So the very skeptical methodology is grounded in this kind of assumption in the first place that there is some ultimate epistemic ground, the clarification of which will allow the more stable and structurally sound edifice of knowledge, and thus the possibility of furthering science. And so Descartes' project, you could say, consists of challenging any objective presupposition where every concept refers to other concepts. And there's an example of that on page 9, where he refers to Aristotle, implicitly at least. So he's like, well, what am I? I'm a man. I'm a human being, in other words. But what is that? What does it even mean to be a human being? So he says, what is a man? Shall I say a reasonable animal or rational animal, as it's usually translated from the Greek? Certainly not. And that's Aristotle's definition. So Aristotle famously gave us 2 definitions of the human, a rational animal and a political or a social animal. So he says, are we a rational animal? Certainly not. For then I should have to inquire what an animal is and what is reasonable or rational. And thus from a single question, I should insensibly fall into an infinitude of others more difficult. So the objective presupposition that, okay, I'm a human being and a human being is a rational animal, and I know what an animal is, I know what is rational and so forth. But if we are questioning, because we are engaged in skepticism, if we're questioning every received truth that we took for granted, well, then that would just proliferate the material for us to interrogate. It would just create more and more layers of it indefinitely. So instead of getting to the true foundation, now we're dealing with an animal. Okay, I'm a rational animal. What is an animal? Well, now we're dealing with rationality. Well, what does it mean to be rational? So instead, he wants to get rid of all of those inherited philosophical, historical definitions or assumptions about who we are and the nature of reality to build entirely anew. Okay, so does that make sense? Any questions about the approach that Descartes is taking here? So I'll stop sharing there, but are there any questions so far? Does everything make sense? Okay, so we're going to dig into the first meditation, and the first meditation is really where he rehearses this powerful methodological doubt. He carries out or performs that project. And then the second meditation is where we get the positive response. So the first meditation is negative. It's destroying the edifice of our knowledge. And the second meditation is Descartes' effort to rebuild it, to lay a new ground. So let's take a little bit of a break, and then we'll come back to this. So if we could meet back here at 11:40, that would be great. So it's about 11:35 now. I'll see you guys in a few minutes. Zoom the recording. All right, let's get back to it. Looks like we lost some people. All right. All right, so we're jumping back in, and we're going to take up the first meditation. So, in terms of Descartes' methodological approach, he wants to subject everything he took for granted as true previously to this unrelenting questioning or skepticism, but he's doing so foundationally. And as we've already discussed, albeit very quickly, the very foundation that we've inherited derives from Aristotelian metaphysics and epistemology. So it's grounded ultimately in the illuminating powers of sense experience. And so that's what Descartes is going to present as the target of his interrogation and of his skeptical doubt. Sense experience, the veracity, that is the trustworthiness of our senses. So he says, don't trust your senses. So he says, a sensible person knows, a reasonable person understands that something that has deceived you even perhaps once before is not 100% trustworthy, right? You should always be a little bit wary of it. And so the same can be said for our sensory powers. So think of all the various ways that we come upon illusions in our senses. We think we perceive something or experience something, but for whatever reason, it turns out that we were mistaken or that we had incomplete information or something like that. So think about how, and these are some examples he uses, from our present perspective, if you look at the sun, and I wouldn't recommend that, by the way, but if you look at the sun, in its sensible appearance to your eyes, it seems quite small, almost as if you could reach up and grab it. But we understand intellectually that that is, as an illusion, the product of the great distance that separates us from the sun as the object of our visual perception. Or, as is cliched, we know that if you take a stick that's quite straight, if you put it in water, it'll appear from a particular point of view to be bent. But you pull it out, you can see that it's quite straight. Or you can go to like a head shop or something and buy one of those, trippy posters with the weird designs that show up in a black light or something, and it'll appear to be swirling. That's a kind of optical illusion. So from your point of view, visually it seems to be moving, or three-dimensional, when in fact it's static and two-dimensional. So our senses are constantly deceiving us. But, and this is the process that Descartes will take us through as a philosopher, he poses a challenge. In this case, we're talking about challenges to the authority of our sense experience, the trustworthiness of the senses. He'll pose a challenge, and then, as good philosophers do, he'll entertain some counterexamples, and he'll walk back a bit from that challenge until he arrives at a new difficulty that isn't accounted for or resolved by the previous effort or the previous point or insight. And so he'll move through these various challenges, first posing them, then walking back a bit, and then moving to an even deeper, more worrying challenge until he arrives at the ultimate challenge. And that's the end of the first meditation. So here's what he says. He says, okay, but you can kind of trust your senses, right? So those examples I gave, the size of the sun, how a stick appears bent when it's straight, there are kind of errors of perception that we experience because of poor lighting conditions. You might mistake an object in a dark room for something else. But these instances are relatively rare, right? So on page 7, he says, but it may be that although the senses sometimes deceive us concerning things which are hardly perceptible or very far away, there are yet many others to be met with as to which we cannot reasonably have any doubt. For example, there is the fact that I am here seated by the fire, attired in dressing gown, having this paper in my hands and other similar matters. And how could I deny that these hands and this body are mine, were it not perhaps that I compare myself to certain persons, devoid of sense, whose cerebella are so troubled and clouded by the violent vapors of black bile that they constantly assure us that they think they are kings when they are really quite poor, or that they are clothed in purple when they are really without covering, or who imagine that they have an earthenware head, or are nothing but pumpkins, or are made of glass. But they are mad, in other words, crazy, and I should not be any the less insane were I to follow examples so extravagant, right? So he's like, all right, well, maybe our senses are more or less reliable. But here's where he says, you could be dreaming, right? So the next paragraph, at the same time, I must remember that I am a man and that consequently I am in the habit of sleeping and in my dreams representing to myself the same things or sometimes even less probable things than do those who are insane in their waking moments. How often has it happened to me that in the night I dreamt that I found myself in this particular place, that I was dressed and seated near the fire, whilst in reality I was lying undressed in bed. At this moment it does indeed seem to me that is with eyes awake that I am looking at this paper, that this head which I move is not asleep, that it is deliberately and of set purpose that I extend my hand and perceive it. What happens in sleep does not appear so clear nor distinct as does all this. But in thinking over this, I remind myself that on many occasions I have in sleep been deceived by similar illusions, and in dwelling carefully on this reflection, I see so manifestly that there are no certain indications by which we may clearly distinguish wakefulness from sleep, that I am lost in astonishment, right? So we all think that right now we're sitting in front of our computers or phones, wherever it is that we might be, awake and engaged in activities in the real material universe. But it could be that we are all asleep. It could be, furthermore, that our entire lives and the memories by which we accessed our past experiences have just been the substance of one long, extended dream. And while in the grip of such a dream, as is often the case for dreamers, we wouldn't be in a position to recognize it as a dream until after the fact. So you usually don't know you're in a dream until you awake, and then reflecting upon the experiences, those oneric or dreamlike experiences that you underwent, you're able from this privileged vantage point to see, that was not real. If it was a nightmare, maybe you are relieved that it wasn't real. So it could be that we're all dreaming, right? So that's the next major problem. Does this make sense so far? Everyone following me? But even if we are in a dream, so if we take that for granted, that right now we are dreaming, so we're not in class right now, we're having a dream. Let's just take that for granted, assume that it's true. He says, at the same time, we must at least confess that the things which are represented to us in sleep are like painted representations, which can only have been formed as the counterparts of something real and true. And that in this way, those general things at least, i.e. eyes, a head, hands, and a whole body, are not imaginary things, but things really existent. For as a matter of fact, painters, even when they study with the greatest skill to represent sirens and satyrs, so those are mythical creatures, right, monsters, by forms the most strange and extraordinary, cannot give them natures which are entirely new, but merely make a certain medley of the members of different animals. Or if their imagination is extravagant enough to invent something so novel that nothing similar has ever been seen before, and that then their work represents a thing purely fictitious and absolutely false, it is certain all the same that the colors of which this is composed are necessarily real. And for the same reason, all these general things, eyes, a head, hands, and such like, may be imaginary. We are bound at the same time to confess that there are at least some other objects yet more simple and more universal, which are real and true. And of these, just in the same way as with certain real colors, all these images of things which dwell in our thoughts, whether true and real or false and fantastic, are formed. To such a class of things pertains a corporeal nature in general, and its extension, the figure of extended things, their quantity or magnitude and number, is also the place in which they are, the time which measures their duration, and so on. Okay, so who can explain in your own words what he's arguing here? What is he getting at in this passage? So what can we really, even if we are dreaming, so taking for granted that that's the nature of our present experience, we're in a dream, can't we know certain things to be true nevertheless? And what are these things that he suggests that we can know whether or not we're in a dream? Any thoughts on that? Any ideas? What is he saying here? So if we're all dreaming right now, is there anything we can nevertheless trust to be true? That is something that truly aligns with reality, whether or not we're in a dream at this moment.
I mean, this is kind of like the point of a lot of the meditation, but just that because you are aware that you are experiencing something, there has to be something behind that awareness. So you do exist on some level, and that's the only thing you can prove.
Well, that isn't the only thing. at this point. So we haven't yet arrived at, to use the phrase that I put forward earlier, epistemic bedrock. But you articulated what that will be. But even in a dream, so whether we're dreaming right now or not, it's indubitable, according to Descartes, that 2 + 2 = 4. It's not as if you can actually dream in any way that you can even conceive of or imagine that, say, 3 + 2 = 43. It's illogical, right? It's, as Hume will say, the absolute boundary of thought, that is conceivability, what we can think. And that's an idea that we've already considered in the context of John Perry's dialogue from last week, when Weyrob was asking for the possibility of survival after death. That is, she wanted to be able to conceive of it in a way that made sense. Conceivability, right? I can't conceive, whether I'm awake or a dream, that 2 + 2 = 7, right? It always is going to equal 4. And even if I happen to dream of horrifying monsters or creatures that I have never experienced in the waking world, the very parts or fundamental aspects from which that creature is illustrated or drawn together are ultimately derived from waking life, that is, from reality. So we dream in color, but those colors have to be dimensions of the world that we experienced in waking life. So it's impossible to dream colors that are not perceptible within a waking experience. So there have to be certain simple aspects that go into the structuring of the real that, even if compositely, even if put together in different arrangements, are doubtful, and they show up as doubtful in the scope of a dream, for example, we can, whether dreaming or not, be assured of certain realities that can't be changed by the fact that we're dealing with a kind of hallucination, because that's one way to think of what a dream is. So even in a dream, 2 + 2 = 4, right?
So sort of like how blind people will dream in just kind of like vague auras and sounds, but if they could see at any point, like if they weren't born blind, then they could still see when they dream.
Right, yeah, because they draw from their waking experience to produce the figures or images that they engage with or experience in a dream. Good. But another thing that he doesn't mention here, but this is connected to his theory, you can be assured of the experiential component of emotional states or reactions within your dream. So in your dream, you might be being chased by a bear or something like that. It's false that that's actually occurring, because in reality, of course, you're asleep in your bed or wherever it is that you happen to go to sleep. But the feeling of terror, that is the first person subjective experience of a certain point of affect or emotion, is very much real. Just like if somebody hallucinates, for whatever reason, a figure that isn't available publicly for anyone else's perception or observation, so no one else can see this figure, it's still true that the hallucinating person is seeing the phenomenon, right? Is actively perceiving it. Now, whether that phenomenon is a real object standing in time and space available for the perceptual experience of others, or an object within their own consciousness alone, that's a separate question, right? But it's true that you are experiencing these emotions or these desires or these fears or whatever else. And so this is what we might describe as the phenomenology of experience, whether waking or dreamlike experience. In the Greek, phenomenon means that which presents itself, that which appears, that which shows itself. So phenomenology then will be the study of or investigation into appearances. So you could say, yes, so if I take a fistful of LSD or something right now, and I hallucinate that the late great rapper DMX is sitting in my office, I am in fact presently perceiving DMX in my office. That's not false. That is true. The falsity arises when I make a secondary judgment and I say DMX is actually sitting in this room such that he would remain even if I left the room, or if others came in, they would see him too. That is to say, the error arises in such judgment when you attribute an externally existing object that corresponds to the subjectively entertained phenomenon or appearance. But if you're only dealing with the phenomenon, there's no falsity, right? So we'll come back to that. And so here's the last moment of the first meditation. So while it's true that even if we are dreaming, the basic principles of mathematics are indubitable, 2 + 2 = 4, even if that's true, what if, and this is where he mentions God, but then as a good pious Christian, he pulls a little bit back from that and presents in his place instead an evil demon or an evil genius. It could be that the very contents of my thinking, the very contents of my consciousness, although I am legitimately thinking them, that is, I am legitimately engaged with them, experiencing them, it could be that they are imposed on me from without by some sort of supremely powerful and perhaps malevolent being who is making me think not only that I am awake when I'm dreaming, but also making me think my entire life perhaps that 2 + 2 = 4, when in fact it equals 7. But since we are in the grip of the manipulative control of this supremely powerful being, we could never escape the scope of that manipulative control to say that it's true or false. That is, we are never in a position, if this is true, well, let me pull back from that a little bit. We are never in a position even to judge whether or not it's true, right? So there's nothing we could do being within the frame of our own first-person subjective awareness, that is consciousness and self-consciousness. We are never in a position to remove ourselves from the scope of that consciousness to judge whether or not we are actively being deceived, right? So this is a famous thought experiment which has been performed and carried out and articulated in a variety of fashions, such as the Matrix movies, right? You think that you're experiencing the world, but everything that you encounter in terms of the contents of the world that you take to be true, insofar as you're engaged with them through time and space, they're actually just artificial images or ideas which have been imposed upon you as stimuli from some source. In the case of the Matrix, it would be the evil machines that are enslaving human beings, turning them into batteries and making them think that they're just going about their everyday lives on planet Earth. Or it could be like Descartes' thought experiment here, that there is some supremely powerful demon that is filling your head with all kinds of falsities, but because there's no way to escape the first person grounding or anchoring of your own subjective self-understanding and understanding of the world, there's no way for you to even tell if it's happening or not, if it's true, right? So this seems to then be the absolute limit. Everything that we take for granted as true from the most stable of our sciences, such as arithmetic, as he mentions here, geometry. It could be that they are not, in fact, as indubitable as we presuppose or presume. There's no way we would know. So does that make sense? Where he arrives at the conclusion of the first meditation? And so this connects, and we'll talk about this in more detail on Thursday, in taking up John Pollock's short story, Brain in a Vat, which was also very influential on the Matrix movies. But we could be in a simulation. So there are many figures like Elon Musk, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and this was first proposed by the British philosopher Nick Bostrom, that we're all living in a supremely sophisticated computer simulation, right? That this isn't reality. And if that's true, the conceit or contention goes, it would be impossible for us to know that truth, to arrive at it, right? So then the very content of our experience of reality could in fact be false. And so, I mean, think about how we typically discriminate between a hallucination and a reality, or something that's true. So you might hallucinate, as I mentioned before, if you're taking hallucinogenic drugs. But the moment you're no longer high, you can, in this privileged position, recognize that what you previously experienced in that state is questionable or perhaps entirely false. Or if you are unfortunately subject to certain schizophrenic tendencies, you might, independent of any kind of artificial substances, hallucinate objects or experiences that aren't there. But you can in any case be brought to recognize that they aren't there because of what others experience. So if you're the only one who sees this giant pink elephant in the room, and all the others that are with you insist that there's nothing there, you might be brought to the conclusion that you're not experiencing truth. But Descartes here is suggesting at this final move, giving us the evil demon thought experiment, he's suggesting, and this is even more insidious than the dream possibility, he's suggesting that we might all, like in the narrative of the Matrix movies, we might all be in the grip of a profound mass hallucination, right? So that means there would be no privileged perspective on the part of others that we could turn to through intersubjective verification, come to figure out what's false and what's true in a situation, because we're all in precisely the same boat. Right? We are all universally, globally being deceived or manipulated. And if that's the case, if we're dealing with a universal mass hallucination, then there would be no possibility for recovering our true sense of reality. Right? So this is the apparently hopeless conclusion that he brings us to in the first meditation. Okay. So, he says at the beginning of the second meditation, maybe all that is certain is that nothing is certain. And this is what we call a crisis, right? So here we find perhaps an artificially ratcheted up through these various thought experiments, epistemic or intellectual crisis, which rocks the very foundation on which the legitimate possibility of the scientific enterprise as we know it is called into question. So are there any questions about the first meditation? So at this point, he has in fact successfully destroyed the very foundation or ground of knowledge, this kind of epistemic bedrock that we received in orientation with received scholasticism. That is, philosophically, epistemologically, the senses are the ground for all knowledge. Descartes has, after the first meditation, sufficiently dynamited, that is, razed to the ground that foundation. And so now we are in this state of crisis. So, how does he recover from this? Again, we're dealing with methodological skepticism, not ancient Pyrrhonian skepticism, for which there is no end state, there's no recovery. For Descartes, there is a recovery insofar as we can find something that is indubitably certain. So, even if there is this supremely powerful evil demon deceiving me, don't I have to exist in order to be deceived? So, I must exist if I'm being deceived or if I'm not being deceived. Either way, I have to exist as the target of that manipulation or as the being that's simply experiencing reality in its true condition. So, existence then, we arrive at existence. But what am I? So, I exist, but what am I? We need to develop some further clarification here. So, here's where he says, challenging these objective presuppositions or assumptions that we take for granted. We can't say I'm a human, and so what's a human? Human is a rational animal, because then we have to ask, well, what is an animal? What is rational? And this takes us down a difficult labyrinthine path from which we might not ever recover. So what else am I? Am I a body? Well, remember at the end of the first meditation, he subjected the very view of himself as bodily to irrevocable doubt, right? In fact, at the end of the first meditation, he doubted that his body exists. He doubted that there is a world. He doubted that there is a moon, a sun, the stars, anything physical at all. Am I a soul? Well, maybe, but we don't yet know what a soul is. And so here's where we arrive at Descartes' most famous and lasting influential contribution to the history of philosophy, getting us perhaps the most famous saying in the entire history of this intellectual discourse. So consider these two sentences. So sentence one, I doubt that my body exists. And we've already seen reasons for this from Descartes and also from our prior discussions. So it could be that you're dreaming that you're a body. It could be that maybe what you assumed as your body before is an artificial construct, that your consciousness has been transferred to a different body, and so forth. So there are reasons that we can entertain, legitimate, rational reasons as to why we might doubt that our body exists. And then the second sentence, I doubt that I exist. So what is a major difference between these sentences? So what are some ideas that you guys have about this? So this is going to bring us to Descartes' powerful insight here. So what's that difference if you, for your own part, say, I doubt that my body exists versus saying, I doubt that I exist?
So from the two sentences, it's claiming that you yourself are not, like, I am not my body, and like my body is my own, but it is not me. It's like putting a separation between the two.
Good. So that's something that shows up in just the grammatical form of this, right? So in the first sentence, I doubt, so I is the subject, and then the predicate, my body exists. So the predicate is made up of a verb and an object. So existence is the verb, and then the body is the object. So this suggests that the body as an object is perhaps different from the I, which is the subject, right? But that doesn't happen in the second sentence. So you simply say, I doubt that I exist. I doubt that I exist. There has to be a subject and a predicate insofar as we're dealing with a grammatically correct sentence. But it seems like in this case, the subject and the object of the predicate are identical, right?
I was leaning more towards the fact that, like, how in the second sentence, like, I doubt that I exist, like I as a human being exist. Whereas in the first sentence, it's saying that I doubt that my body exists. So it's differentiating, like, I existing and my body existing.
Good.
Like, two
Yeah, so an important consequence of that point, of that difference, is when you end the second sentence, there's still something left over following the doubt. So let's say your doubt destroys whatever it is it's doubting. So in the first sentence, your doubt would destroy your body, but there's still an I that exists. In the second sentence, your doubt destroys the I, right? And that's all there is. So notice an important upshot of that. I doubt that my body exists. This is easily performed. We've done it several times already, not just today, but last week as well. We can easily doubt that our bodies exist. So it could be that I'm in a dream and this body is a complete fiction, right? There are all sorts of sci-fi scenarios we can come up with to imaginatively but still forcefully doubt that we are bodies, or that our bodies exist in the way that we perceive them or experience them. Now, before we move on to the second sentence, I should just clarify, and this is true for Descartes too. He's not some extreme weirdo. He's not actually denying that his body exists. That's not important. You might not doubt that your body exists. I certainly don't doubt that my body exists. It's not a problem that I'm constantly experiencing and fretting over. It's just that it's possible to doubt it. So it's possible to doubt that my body exists, to actually converse with each other about these issues, right? So that's the important point to recognize. But notice what happens when we move to the second sentence. I doubt that I exist. This is not possible. This is what philosophers refer to then as a performative contradiction. And it's a contradiction because the very moment you express, I doubt that I exist, you are simultaneously affirming that you exist. Because to be able to doubt, you have to exist. If you didn't exist, you couldn't doubt, right? So then if you say, I doubt that I exist, in the very same expression that you're calling into question your existence, you are strongly affirming that very existence. So even if you say, I doubt that I exist, whether you're aware of the contradiction or not, you are expressing the very certitude of that existence that you are so explicitly questioning or denying, right? Does that make sense? So this is where Descartes arrives at epistemic bedrock. And this is the famous Latin phrase, cogito ergo sum, perhaps the most famous phrase in the history of philosophy. I think, therefore I am. And this expression doesn't come up in this precise form in the Meditations. It was actually expressed in this form in the earlier work, Discourse on Method, from a few years prior. But the very sense of this, the concept, is articulated in a really dramatic, phenomenological way. And that's why Descartes is engaged in this project through the work of meditation, right? So he's the meditator. He's thinking through these questions and arriving along a certain pathway at determinate conclusions. And we, the readers, are simply invited to travel with the meditator along this path to arrive at the very same conclusions with respect to ourselves, right? So then this is referred to in shorthand as the cogito, which is the ever-renewing event of thought. So anytime you think anything, such as, in this case, I doubt that I exist, you are liminally, implicitly affirming your very existence. So when I think to myself, because I want a drink of coffee, there's a coffee cup on my table. Implicitly behind that proposition, there's a coffee cup on my table, is the frame, I think there is a coffee cup on the table, because it's posited for my subjectivity, my subjective awareness or consciousness that there is this object before me. And that determinate truth as a conclusion is arrived at only through my subjective understanding. That is to say, my thinking And if there is thinking, then there has to be a being who is doing the thinking. In other words, a subject, a consciousness, an existence, a soul for Descartes. That's ultimately what the soul is, as the immaterial, unobservable condition, necessary condition for the very possibility of experiencing any objects, any ideas, any truth, or indeed any falsity. And so this, to now respond to Shane's question from earlier, if Shane is still here, this is one of those things which cannot be proven necessarily, because it doesn't need to be proven, because it proves itself. And that's why we're referring to this now as the ever-renewing event of thought. And so this particular formulation of the cogito from the Discourse on Method is slightly misleading grammatically, because it's presented as an argument. And that's because of the word therefore, from the Latin ergo. So it looks like the conclusion is I am, or I exist, and the premise of the argument is I think. But in fact, Descartes understands this to be an immediate intuition, which cannot be doubted or even questioned. So it's something that we always already know, whether we are explicitly cognizant of it in this or that moment or not. So even if you try to doubt it, in that very effort of doubting it, you are simply affirming it, and there's no escape from it, your own existence. And it's for that reason that we reach epistemic bedrock, that in our own case, each of us, we cannot doubt our own being. And this becomes the absolute foundation for the very possibility of the scientific enterprise. So it is the one capital T truth as the ground on which any smaller t truths, that is facts that we uncover through scientific inquiry, can be constructed and sustained. Okay, so the one thing that cannot be doubted without contradiction is that you exist. And so we're out of time, but we'll pick this up at the beginning of class next time, and we'll wrap up some of these things. We'll examine some of the arguments. First, the argument from the first meditation, or the second meditation, just kind of encapsulation of that argument. And then, because there are major problems with it, we'll look at a better argument that he gives us in meditation 6. And so, yeah, are there any final questions before we go? All right, guys, so I'll see you on Thursday. I'm looking forward to the presentation, and we'll wrap up our discussion of the soul through Rene Descartes. So hope you're having a good week. I'll see you Thursday.
See you Thursday. Bye.
I have a question about the presentation. Is it everyone talking and the PowerPoint?
You don't have to use PowerPoint. You can.
So
it's,
we're just, oh, sorry.
Yeah, so you're free to use any kind of media that you want, or free to not use any media. But the idea is every member of the group should contribute. You should say something, so everyone should speak. It doesn't have to be that everyone speaks equally, but you might be contributing more in terms of your research or preparation for the presentation, in which case you'll just mention that as you describe how you contributed and participated in the email that you send me.
Okay, and are we just discussing like about what we think about it, or like asking questions?
Both, yeah, it's whatever you want to do. So it's free, it's pretty open in terms of how you want to take up the assignment. So different groups will do it differently, and even within each group, different members will do things differently. You might assign like one person to talk about the Avicenna reading. You might assign one person in the group to talk about the John Pollock reading. Then you might assign someone who wants to connect those readings to Descartes, or you can do it differently. And you can use that opportunity to, as you said, to describe some of the important concepts, arguments, conclusions, ideas, or questions that you encounter in the work. Or you might just ask questions yourself and try to engage the class in helping you figure things out if you're confused about something in the text. So it's really up to you guys how you want to do it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
See you Thursday.
All right, see you then.